everybody. Thank you all for coming. I will endeavour to keep my voice at this pitch, but if it drops, let me know. This is going to be one of the most, hopefully one of the most easygoing and friendly of events or discussions you're ever going to be on. And you're all going to be part of it, because it's not just us talking amongst ourselves, it's everybody talking to everybody. So we will be calling on for your opinions. Start with housekeeping. If the world starts to go wrong from inside here, get out. The easiest ways to get out are directly behind or directly behind. So just do the directly behind and exit, and then hopefully we'll find our way to convene outside there, inside the courtyard, so we can check everybody and make sure that we are all here. That's in event of fire or other such disaster. If the event that occasions your wanting to leave is inability to stand somebody else, please bear with us and allow us to burn you up a little bit. We are kind people, and we will make a memorial to you thereafter. The purpose of today is to discuss something that is not particularly thought of, and that's not just how we. It's not just how we get about, but how the different ways that we use to get about affect and influence our experience of the world around us, the activities that we do and partake in, and the people that we meet, and the way all of these things impact on us and impact our outlook. So we're going to be looking at things through the views of different people from different sectors of society, and hopefully through each and every other person's eyes. The idea is that we want to learn from each other. There are no rights or wrongs, except the ones that I call right and wrong, because I'm always right. And I would hope that the idea from this, or what comes out of this, is a little bit more understanding, a little bit more objectivity, and a slight chance that you start to look at the city you live in through the eyes that you take on holiday. We'll get to that in a short while. So, this is a joint event between Hammersmith and Fulham Cycling and the Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and we are pleased to be we're pleased to have this here as part of the climate Carnival in this new building, which is a community space, newly opened. We're kind of like scratching the floor and making it warm. So everybody, please enjoy yourselves, and let's partake in this. I'd like to introduce the panelists here. We are all pretty much local residents, local workers, local people, but that is only valid to the point that we have a local experience. Local is something that we take wherever we go. So if we have somebody coming over here from New York, while you're here, you're local, and your experience and points will be valid. And with that, I'd like to introduce, starting on my left, which will be on your right, Brenda Pugh. So Brenda is an inclusive access consultant by profession and an active transport activist. She's chair of Hackney Living Streets and on the committee of Hackney Cycling Campaign, and has campaigned for many years on local active travel for all. She's one of the founders of the London Parklet campaign, after successfully campaigning for a community parklet program in Hackney via direct action, in other words, guerrilla campaigning. The London Parklet campaign supports activists in London and beyond to get permission for community parklets. And it's worth knowing that just recently, a parklet here in the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham won the best parklet in London in the show competition. So, ladies and gentlemen, Brenda, and she'll explain to us.
Sorry, do you want me to?
Yes, please. Tell the world about yourself.
Oh, okay. So, Casey's given me a very good introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in Hammersmith and Fulham, and to have fellow activists here on the Parklets campaign. So it's only one of my campaigns. I'm actually, living streets and pedestrian, making streets safer and better for pedestrians is what I'm mainly involved in, and obviously, well, quite often there's a conflict between that and the needs of cyclists, and we're very much aware of that being played out in Hackney and in Hammersmith and Fulham as well. So that's one of the, probably if I talk, that is one of the conflicts I'll talk about, because it's very, very strong in Hackney, that particular conflict between the needs of pedestrians and the needs of cyclists. And I'd say that the other conflict is between the needs of disadvantaged, poorer disadvantaged communities and families who drive and for whom at the moment they can live a very comfortable lifestyle with their car because parking is virtually free and driving is comparatively easy, so they build their lifestyle on the use of the car, and for them there is a lot of suffering, real suffering, which you don't have if you're more privileged and can easily get rid of your car. I'll use an Uber from now on, or I'll use a taxi if I need a car, or I'll get my stuff delivered because I can afford it. So there's a huge conflict between people, and that I know because I live on a council estate, and I know the people how precious their free car parking space is to them, and how it binds the family together, and it gives them certain status. So there's something really to I find, and again because these people you live cheek by jowl with them, those conflicts. I think we should understand them and not. And quite often we end up mocking people for being car dependent or dismissing them or being disparaging of them. But I think one really, and I think I thought about this when Casey said, think in the feet of other people. And it was, I'll just give a quick example of a retired man on my estate. And as soon as the low traffic neighbourhoods came in Hackney, he was devastated. He resigned from the committee and said, what? And he's saying you can't resign because he was the vice chair. And he says, that since I've retired, my only meaning to life, I swear this is what he said, his only meaning of life is his wife is not retired, but she works about 5 miles away. So he drove her to work every morning, and then he picked her up every afternoon. And that gave his life meaning. He had 2 jobs to do, and he did those jobs, and now those jobs were taken away from him because he couldn't drive because of the low traffic neighbourhood, and he felt worthless. He said, there's nothing left for me to live for, literally. I'm leaving Hackney, I'm going to go and live in the seaside where I can drive my wife around. I don't know what his wife thought of it. She probably, I don't know whether she felt grateful or whatever. But he was totally devastated, and you could just, and then I see other neighbours, the council tenants living on the margin, and their children come to visit, and the parking is free. You're living in central Hackney with £1 million houses, and the parking there is free on council estates. So they can come and, the visitor parking, they can come and park there, visit their So their lifestyle is facilitated by having free. And my whole thing is about parking, because I want parking to be the market price of parking, not free, but £1,000 a year, which is what it should cost. At least it should cost how much it costs the council to administrate, because at the moment the council hugely subsidises residential car parking all over London. So it might cost the council £400 to administer. We're not talking about the value of the space, it's just the administration of a car parking space. They'd only charge you £100. And if it's an electric car and you're really, really rich, then it's free. So the richer you are, the more likely that your parking is going to be free, which is what Hackney is now proposing, and probably other boroughs will also propose.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction.
So that's all. So it's just setting the context of how difficult, how to try and put ourselves in other people's.
Thank you.
And I'll talk about the cyclists and the pedestrian issue later.
Thank you for the context, because we will actually come to some of these in detail.
Can I ask a quick question? How many households in Hackney don't have a car?
It is 65% who don't have a car. But the 35 who do, a lot of them. The thing is, you're either very rich or you're very poor, and the poor people do have. So the very rich actually don't mind too much. It's the poor people who do mind, and who are people living on the margin, absolutely on the margin, for whom an extra penalty or tripling parking is going to make a huge difference to their lifestyle. For richer people, their lifestyle won't be affected.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's first introduce the rest of the panel. So thank you. And next panel member who I'd like to introduce is Massim Chowdhury. Now, Massim is the head of transport for Hammersmith and Fulham. We've got a big fish. So Massim has been working within the transport sector of local government for over a decade. And he's a knowledgeable strategist who specialises in front-end strategy and concept aspects of infrastructure schemes. Hold on a minute. What does that mean?
Thank you, Chair and Casey, for that difficult question. No, it's really the extreme front end of transport. So it's right from the strategy development, working on the evidence basis for policy, and developing the scheme concepts based on the data that we collect as well. So that's probably the best way to describe it, really. So if you think of a project life cycle, the extreme front end right through the development of concepts, and then detailed design would ordinarily be someone in design and delivery team, really.
So would I be right to say that what you do is you take a look at what needs to happen, or what the end objective is meant to be? In other words, people need to move around, or people need to have space on the roads, and then you look at the different things that need to happen for that to work, and then you devise a plan to roll that out.
Yes, I think that's a good
And then you point to somebody else and say, okay, this is what we want to do, you do it.
no, unfortunately it doesn't end there, but I think the concept development stays within the transport service as well. So it is coming up with the concept and working through, some of the difficult challenges that we have as well. On the road network, there's a lot of things to balance, not only the community needs and aspirations, but also balancing our duty as a traffic and highway authority as well. So that's really how it goes, and what shapes our forward agenda is more or less the policies that we've adopted as a local authority.
To my right, we have George. Now, this is George Averoni, who is a sixth form student at Chelsea Academy. He is a prefect, former captain of the football team, and a goalkeeper for Q Park Rangers and Fulham FC Kicks. George represented his school in the regional finals of the Jack Pitchie Speak Out Challenge and actually he represented the borough of Kensington, Chelsea, and addressed the Hammersmith and Fulham cabinet as a 14-year-old following a road traffic collision on his way back from football training. George travels across London using all modes of transport: buses, bicycle, tube, e-scooter, trains, walking, and very occasionally by car. So, George, who are you?
Well, I'd say I'm a very active 16-year-old. I have many friends like all over London. I've found friends through basketball, football, cousins I know, friends of friends, and so I like to get around London. I like to see a lot of people. So through any form of transport, really, trains, buses, bike, my scooter, whatever is like the most convenient for me. So I'd say I'm very well versed in getting around London. I'd say I also can speak for many other young people who have similar or shared experiences, because it's something that like a lot of young people I think have issues with, transport, the way it works, and also the pricing and how like pricey it can get, especially for people who are traveling regularly. So yeah, I think I don't have something to bring to the discussion.
And on the extreme right, we have... that doesn't make him right-wing. We have Julian Lecoeur. Now, Julian is a videographer who runs a company, Prolific TV. He also runs the Disabled People's channel on Facebook. This was designed to make disabled people worldwide more aware of each other's conditions and relax the next generations of employers' attitudes and fears towards disabilities by seeing them broadcast online. It's been active for approaching 3 years, with currently around 2,100 followers, and the Facebook page has many disabled editors on an international level. Its other key principle is networking in the disabled community and encouraging other disabled people to make the videos, of which they have produced 33 to date, correct? Yeah. Julian rides a bicycle when he can, but he does not drive. He is a regular cyclist because he really enjoys it and uses it to control his sugar levels due to his type 1 diabetes, which needs constant monitoring and regular daily exercise to keep it in control. He relies on the assistance of his mother to drive him when he needs to get around by car. Julian is registered disabled and lives and operates with epilepsy. He remains off his bike altogether during his cluster periods, and he logs his seizures very carefully. His NHS treatment has not resolved this issue, but his inspiration for the channel, Disabled People's Channel, was from the excellent group Epilepsy Action in Ealing. Julian lives in Fulham Broadway with his mum, and independently in a small flat in East Acton. Julian?
Thank you for having me along. Yeah, it's fascinating. Great use to be part of this space as well. I'm really, really pleased on how it's going to link the community together. But yeah, that's all quite accurate information. On a travel level, yes, I was driving for a year until epilepsy first emerged in my life in my early 20s. And I immediately accepted it was far too dangerous to be driving a car. You might say to me, well, why are you on a bicycle? As I pointed out there, I've had to accumulate a massive level of discipline that I've only learned in the last few years, having smashed my shins quite a lot recently, and having very sore knees from time to time. That have, during my epilepsy, I have cluster periods where as soon as I've identified I'm inside one, I have to basically just wait for that cycle to go through. But also, as mentioned, cycling has been a wonderful form of controlling your sugar, because I have to inject after every meal and I have to make quite accurate injections, but it's still very, very fierce on your body unless you exercise it, because what you do is you smooth the movement of your insulin or your sugar. And if it's just an injection, you fly down through the floor and it's very uncomfortable. So therefore, exercise is a real motivation when it's to get somewhere. So on the basis of travel, I'm also obliged during those periods to use the London Underground and buses. I'm most keen on buses. I'm also quite disciplined on the distance I can go because, sad to say, but I'm 45, I still have a mum who can keep an eye on where I am with the app called Life 360, where there's been occasion where, because I've been in a state of epilepsy, I've not been clear on where I am. However, I've been in Fulham all my life, apart from my flat in East Acton, since we moved in from Barnes when I was 1 year old, and she's still got the place of my mum. Nice house she's got here, and wonderful areas, so nice to be at home.
Okay, this is the part where we start to, this is the part where we look to see what we see first. I have a question there.
Yeah, we know you as well.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Casey Averoni. I happen to be George's father. So this is a bit of nepotism on the panel. I am also the chair of Hammersmith and Fulham Cycling. Hammersmith and Fulham Cycling is the local branch of the London Cycling Campaign, and our purpose is to make streets more, I won't say welcoming, but more usable for people who do cycle, and more accessible for the people who would cycle if they felt safe. As such, we engage with users, with policymakers, with implementers, and we take information and understanding from pretty much everybody around us, because we tend to look at cycling as hyper-walking. So we have to, so it's in our interest to do the best that we can, take the information that we can gather, and do what we can to expand the accessibility of our cities. This means that we primarily our primary function is to learn and then to disseminate. So thank you, and I'm Casey. So let's start by looking outwards. When you look out, what do you see? Let's have a view of your streets. You know, when you look out of your window, what's your perspective? Massim, let's start with you.
Okay, sure. So I actually have two perspectives because I've recently moved home as well. And if you don't mind, I'll give the perspective from me as an individual, if that's okay. So until recently, I lived in a flat which was on the apartment building was on a main road and very, very close to a junction of the motorway, the M25. So, when I looked out of my window, there was a lot of traffic at peak times leading on to the junction of the M25. I was right near quite a busy carriageway. It was a 4-lane, 2 lanes each direction as well. And also very, very close to the apartment building, the speed limit changed from 30 to 40 miles an hour just on the approach to the junction. So that was the view from my window until not too long ago. And I've recently moved to quite a suburban rural area, and the view now is quite different actually. It's, there's not a lot of through traffic at all. So there's not that passing traffic trying to get onto the main road network. The roads are quite nice. There's a lot of green. There's grass verges as well. And actually, when you look out my window at the weekends, there's children playing as well. So it's really, really quite a stark difference as well. And I think that gives at least demonstrates that, geography and size is quite key to what you see, as well as where you're living as well. So that's what I'm seeing at the moment right now, and I think there's some lessons in that as well.
Brenda?
So I live on a narrow street that's got a row of car parking at one on the far end, and on the inside it's just cycling and walking, but it's a regular cycle route. So when people were commuting pre-pandemic, the pedestrians and cyclists, huge conflict. Cyclists are going to work and coming back, and the pedestrians are saying, we've got to ban the cyclists, we've got to ban the cyclists. We cannot have cyclists coming through here. But the elephant in the room was this row of car parking, and literally our estate might have 200 homes, and 14 car parking spaces were taking up the whole width, one whole length of the street. And the obvious answer was, if you get them to park in garages which are available on the estate, then you could free up that space. But no, we go on, and the circle goes on and on. We have to get rid of the cyclists, we have to get rid of the cyclists, we have to get rid of the cyclists. God forbid we get rid of those 14 car parking spaces. That could easily then provide a cycle lane down that end. So that's one of the things that we have, a constant conflict on our streets, which luckily is reduced now because people aren't commuting as much, so there isn't that much conflict, at peak hours. But what you do see is lots of charming, people who walk. There's 2 schools, school kids, cyclists. It's really lovely, and often you see if there's an empty space where no one is parking, which you get quite often. People sit on the curb, to make a phone call, just to have a chat, to talk to each other, because there's nowhere for them to sit on the curb, on the edge, with their legs on the tarmac. And in fact, that was why I was inspired. I said, I have to take one of these spaces and have a parking bay, and show people what's possible to create a pretty garden in a car parking space. So that used to be my view for 4 weeks until it was evicted by the council. I had a beautiful parking bay, a beautiful parklet that I had created right in the parking space in front of my home. So that was my view. Now my home is a row of car parking. Or if people wanting to sit, you have to sit on the curb and dangle your feet onto the tarmac. So that's what we now have on my street.
George, what do your streets look like, and what do you see when you step out?
So I live on New Kingsroad. And so when I look out of my window, I see cars, almost always, just cars and more cars. Our road is populated by a lot of shops. So there's an answer to bed across the street. There was a shop on either side, both are now vacant. But there are shops all along our road with small apartment blocks kind of smushed in between them. And it is very much just, you look outside and you see cars, you don't see many people walking. And there's just always constant traffic. Like I step out for school, there's traffic, and I come home from school, there's traffic, and I go out to play football, there's traffic. And there's just always traffic. And then the one time we didn't have traffic was when COVID struck, and the roads were empty. And there were times during the pandemic where in the evenings, like 7, 8 o'clock, when it's just starting to get dark, I'd go outside and I'd sit on my post box or outside my house. And it was very peaceful, it was calm. You could sit there and there were no cars, and it was a nice change, always living around noise and pollution, and then to come outside during COVID and sit in the silence and the calm. It was very nice. Unfortunately now we no longer have that. So yeah, my view is very much just traffic and cars.
When you're out and moving around, what do the streets look like on your journeys?
So, take for example me going to turn off to the side, it's very much no traffic. It's not necessarily that cars don't go through that area, but it's just there's less traffic in that area. More people choose to commute, especially to my school. There's a very low population of people commuting by cars, mainly trains and public transport. And so it is much nicer to walk in the kind of side streets and less populated and busy areas of our neighborhood. But very much the main roads are populated with cars, and it's very difficult to get around.
And Julian?
Well, I've absolutely split down the middle on many levels because although I'm not a driver, I do depend on getting around in the car quite a lot. My mum's on Berkeley Road, which is a dead end, which is 2 streets off Stamford Bridge, so one of the most populated areas in the world on a football day, and not to the point that you can't even get into Fulham Broadway Station. But the point generally I would say about travelling is that in the last few years, because she's got massive back issues when she drives for a while, we've just elected to keep journeys quite short. I would say definitely from a cyclist point of view, what I unquestionably do is avoid main roads and busy roads. I designed a route actually off of my mind very, very carefully to avoid trafficy roads. To an extent the cyclist can do. In terms of conflict between cyclists and pedestrians, it's definitely there. You do have to be quite polite. One of our biggest problems, I'd say, emerged in the last year is that everybody was having their food delivered by quite eager but underpaid cyclists who would often slide down the pavement, throw their bike against the side of the building and sort of squeeze in the doors, while pedestrians were trying to do it too. So I'd say there's a discipline on all road levels actually, but I'm a bit 50-50 when it comes to criticising anything of it. The one thing I would have to say is the exact antithesis of what we've heard. The cost of parking around here is phenomenal.
Still subsidised.
Question?
Do you know that the average car spends 95% of its time parking? That's the equivalent of 10 Hyde Parks.
We could attest to that because just in case anybody, every time you have somebody complaining about cyclists, the first thing they tell you is, I am a cyclist. So without complaining about cars or drivers, the first thing I will point out is that I have the view from all sides. We own a car as well. Let's try something then. Switch positions. Now, George, take a look through the eyes of, say, Brenda, or take a look, pick somebody's experience and take a look and through it, and then see how would that feel for you, or how would that fit in your world.
Okay, Brenda. So you said that you live on a road with just cars parked, and then very difficult for cyclists and pedestrians to. I'd say for me as a cyclist, I find it very difficult to work with. Definitely with the frequency that I use my bike or my electric scooter, I think I'd definitely have problems with pedestrians if there's not enough space to get through, because either they're slowing down or I can be putting them in danger, and then see a bunch of cars lined up doing nothing, sitting there, I find extremely annoying, to be honest, because what's the point when everything can just be moved? So yeah, I can definitely see where the frustration is.
Massim, pick somebody else's view.
Okay. So I think maybe I'd maybe take George's view, I guess, because he's a young person. He's trying to socialise and see friends as well. And I expect you also use public transport, George, is that right? when you're looking out of your window, you're seeing a lot of traffic. It's a main road, King's Road as well, so of course it's got to serve multiple purposes as well. I mean, I'm aware there's residential dwellings there as well as commercial shops as well. I think there's a lot of difficult factors to balance on the main road because there's businesses who want people to come and attend there as well. It's a main road, so public transport is very, very key. And also, there is always a need for people to move around, be it by vehicles as well. So, how do you balance that as well? Obviously, from your perspective, you're living in that community and you're looking out of the window and seeing certain things, but there's lots of other members of the community who also need to move around, and the main road is one of those areas which need to serve a purpose of mobility as well. So that's one of the things I thought would be quite an interesting thing to pick up.
Brenda, let's take Julio's position.
Okay, so if, let's say I'm Julian in a bus, and I think there you have, because buses are mainly on main roads and you've got cycle lanes, well, you more and more, the cyclists legitimately want separate cycle lanes. They don't want to mix with the buses. They want segregated cycle lanes. And we have this happening because the bus user groups say, well, we don't want cycling is going to slow us down, and and then the biggest issue that happens, and the biggest conflict that happens is what do you do? Well, how do you? It's crossing the road if you're a pedestrian. Particularly if you have a two-way cycle lane, you don't know which way to look because you look right, and then they're coming in both directions. So you don't know how to cross, and it's okay if it's a flexible cycle lane that you can cross, but if it's got a curb and you've got a trolley or whatever, a shopping trolley that you're trying to cross the road, once you get off the bus, then how do you cross the road? And the other big issue then is your what we're dealing with in many councils is the bus stop bypass, because you get off the bus and you could be, if you're disabled, you could be for whatever reason you're not thinking, and next thing there's a cyclist coming, just whizzing around you, and it's a shock to the system, and so you either, and so if I'm, so if you're getting off the bus, then the last thing you think you got off the bus and now I'm safe, but you're not. You've got to negotiate. And then the thing is, not all bus stops are the same. Some have the bypasses, some don't. So you've got to know which ones do, which ones you've got to pay attention to. So it's an additional stress on bus users to have this, either get stuck in traffic because you're on the outside of the cycle lane, or if you're on a bus stop, then to have, when you get off the bus stop, to have to negotiate crossing a two-way cycle. I think the two-way cycle lanes for me are the most difficult to negotiate, because you often don't know that it's two ways when you're a pedestrian. So you're looking in one direction and they're coming at you in both directions. It's counterintuitive. And I think it's difficult for cyclists as well. So I'd say, yes, the conflict between this, particularly if you're a disabled older pedestrian, to have the focus to know, to have this extra thing to negotiate, coming to a footway near you, because inevitably cycle lanes are quite often carved into footways. And we used to, in Hackney Living Street, we used to say, no, you can't do that. You can't take the space away from the footway. And they say, well, the footway is wide enough. It's plenty wide enough. It can accommodate both. So I think probably there has to be a bit of give and take. If you really have a wide footway, then, to take half of it to put in a two-way cycle lane, maybe. But but sometimes they put them on narrow footways as well. So I think there is conflict there, and I think maybe both parties have to be patient with each other, but both are just as vociferous about their rights, and somehow never the twain shall meet, because both sides are so feel so strongly about what their rights are. So how do you reconcile it? I think it needs a bit of patience and
a lot more
understanding from both sides. Compromise.
I've got a comment on two-way cycle lanes. You probably know it quite well. It's been built just outside of Hammersmith and Fulham, but on Chiswick High Road, all the way down to Kew Bridge. And I find it actually a very dangerous experience. I do. Because it's covered actually also in stopping points for cyclists, which represent like zebra crossing, etc., which are small sets of lights for cyclists, but people ignore them as cyclists. Secondly, instinctively, you have many, many different types of cyclists within a cycle lane. You have the aggressive, I'm all pumped up, I've got my smooth helmet on, I've got my quick wheels. And to have people running in opposite direction to each other at fast times in a cycle lane where most people avoid, not most, but at least 50% of cyclists avoid the red lights on the stopping points in terms of zebra crossing, is actually quite a dangerous concept. And I'm a cyclist in that area of over 30 years, and I quite consciously avoid that two-way cycle lane.
Okay. And how would you, what's your view looking at sort of like, if you were to take Massim Street, the view from the corner with the traffic and the busy streets?
Well, you can sort of reverse it completely and say that, these things can be very well built and useful, but generally, I think sometimes they're built well on paper, but in practice they're not necessarily the absolute answer.
If the audience has a view or questions.
The first question there.
Well, I've lived for the last 9 years in a city in northern Germany where they have a proper strategy for cycling and active transport. 43% of journeys are made by bicycle in that city. And the things that I can say is that there are almost no two-way cycle lanes in an urban environment. Those are only used in extra-urban and rural environments. There's a common design language for shared spaces. Almost all the cycling lanes in the city are on pavement, and there's a common design language throughout the city so that pavement users, cyclists and pedestrians instinctively know which space they're supposed to be in. And also that design language applies to the design of bus stops, some of which have routes around the back of them and some of which have routes around the front of them. But there's a common design language, so it's easy to navigate, to know where you are when you get off the bus. You know what a cycle lane looks like if it's going around the back of the bus stop. And really and I would say that those cycle lanes, when you move to that city, you'd never know there were cycle lanes because there's actually just a slight surface difference between the cycle lane and the pavement. It's very subtle.
But can't you end up walking in the cycle lane?
Sorry?
Can't you end up walking in the cycle
Yes, but
lane?
people don't, because you can tell the difference, you can see the difference. There's a difference in the surface between, because they all have these porous pavements, so the water runs away through the pavement. But bricks in the roadway up in the pavement are different from the pavement to the cycle lane. It's subtle, they're not painted with big signs all over the place. There aren't cycling signs, you just know, once you've been there a week, you know what the cycling lanes look like.
And people are disciplined, that's most important.
But what about visually impaired people and, if there's not enough difference, how can they...
I think there's enough difference. There's a
negotiate?
slight texture difference. They're very...
In other words,
mindful.
this is something which can be ameliorated by design.
Yes.
So if we design the right environment, then we can create the right outcomes.
The one thing I wanted to say is that it does take some getting used to. But that having a common design language citywide really helps you to do that. But it takes a bit of getting used to, and I think that we inevitably see teething problems when we build these things, because people have to get used to the idea that people are going to be, cycling on the pavement or cycling, next to the pavement.
It's correct. It's a learning curve.
Since we're on that, I have to say one more thing about the new cycle lanes. They're pillared off. Okay? So imagine you're cycling along the road and you want to do a right turn. As a cyclist, well, you can't. They've got a sets of pillars, so you can't actually weave through the pillars and expect to not notice a car behind you or a car coming towards you. You're in a very dangerous state.
No, you can merge into the traffic and turn
It's
right.
dangerous.
It's
dangerous. You have to do virtually a right turn and assume you haven't got a car behind you.
Are these walls, flexible walls or fixed
They're separate pillars, but they're only a few metres wide. You cannot do. The whole point of not having those pillars is that you can do a smooth ride, you can look over your shoulder, you can check that there's no one behind you, there's no one coming, you can do a smooth angle out. When you've got pillars, between, a couple of metres apart, well, you can't do that. You have to literally do immediate right
Can
turn.
I ask why exactly?
It's dangerous stuff. No,
Julian, can I ask why exactly a cyclist would want to do a right
turn into a right road?
A right turn into the flow of traffic.
No, you do it. I'm saying if you're on the left-hand side of the road and you want to do a right turn into a right side road, yeah. Normally, you just angle off and you make sure that you've got no one behind you, no one in front of you, and you take that nice smooth angle. But if you're including a pillar that's in a metre and a half, you do have to sort of jump out to the right, and basically you could be killed by something behind you.
The answer to that would typically be that most cycle
Get off your bike and walk across.
That most cycle lanes are they are constructed with an awareness of junctions, so that you don't have junctions. But let's take Henrietta.
As a disabled cyclist, I'm absolutely dependent on my bicycle. I can only walk 5 minutes, so I have to cycle everywhere.
So,
and for me, that cycle lane along Chiswick is so much safer, because what is dangerous on the roads are the cars.
Yes.
The cars and the lorries.
Well, do you do those right turns that I'm requiring?
Yes, I have
And
turned.
how do you do it in those spaces between those pillars?
It's very easy. I've got very good. Well, perhaps you can't turn your head, but my neck moves quite well.
No.
I've got good brakes. I stop where I'm trying to go across. I look for the traffic, and I feel safe because there are these rows of brightly lit reflective pillars, and then I cross when it's safe. It's the easiest thing possible.
George?
I'm not certain exactly which of the pillars you are talking about, but as an example, in Wandsworth, at Wandsworth Bridge Road, if you take the exit towards Clapham, along the road there where there are a lot of roadworks and there's buildings being done right now, they've sectioned off a cycle lane using the pillars, except the way that it's constructed, whenever you're near a junction or a traffic light, the pillars end so that if you need to leave the cycle lane, to turn in a certain direction, you can, which I think is very helpful because it means that you're sectioned off from the cars, and then when you need to join.
And what happens when a car's turning around, backed into a couple of pillars? You've got no way of weaving around it.
Why would a car turn around?
I've seen it happen.
Yes,
use that space.
Yes,
They back into them.
If we take that example, then that would mean that the same driver, if you do not have those pillars, will simply drive into the car.
Well, ultimately, I'm talking about in the context of what I've experienced in a two-way cycle lane. I mean, there may be situations where it's a safer concept. But
Is your question related to the two-way lane, the two pillars?
So that leads us nicely onto the next next question that we're going to look at, which is, what would work for you, and at what or whose cost? So let's take it for you now.
What would work?
Yes.
I just give you the context of the pillars. You often have a faster cyclist behind you. Yeah, how do they overtake you if there's pillars, you're on a one-way lane? That is utterly ridiculous, actually. You haven't got enough space. But if I could change it, I would essentially, I suppose, just go with the idea that people get in more trouble for breaking traffic light rules, actually. Yeah. Much as it's horrible to cyclists, they should not break traffic light rules. They should not cycle through red lights, and they often do. Because they can get away with it.
I'll need to qualify that because first things first is that 70% of all road traffic collisions are caused by car drivers.
Accept that. It makes me ill to see the way cyclists
interestingly enough, 70% of all the victims of road traffic collisions are pedestrians.
What I'm suggesting is because we haven't got an identifier on a bicycle, you can get away with breaking the law and just cycling through lanes.
But the question is, what level of the road traffic danger is presented by the actual cyclists?
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
Actually.
Statistically,
a lot of people don't signal a turn.
Yes, but statistically they are not responsible for any.
Possibly, but I've seen a lot of.
Yeah, but they're not responsible for any of the actual danger on the road. They don't
necessarily have such, horrible crashes. Like that.
Yes. So if they don't cause the injury to other people,
it's not
then
exactly.
They are not. No, this is
a style of cycling.
But they are ultimately, if they are not the ones causing the injury to people, then they are not the problem.
Because I don't accept that entirely. I accept the fact is you've got to have, so it's almost doing full circle, you've got to have respect for both car drivers and pedestrians, that you don't weave in front of a pedestrian.
But how do we address
percentage of people in London that think they can break their way with breaking rules?
How do you address the question of road traffic danger if you're focusing on the least?
I don't know how to change the attitude of car drivers because I'm not in that category.
Okay. Then let me take a question from Perry.
It's not a question. I supported that cyclists, people, I don't call them cyclists, I call people riding bicycles. I support you in that regard. People riding bicycles shouldn't be crossing on red traffic light. It doesn't matter whether it's safe for them. But and you say that you should hold them responsible. By the same token, pedestrians cross on red traffic light like
But it's legal.
all the time.
It's not illegal.
No, I'm doing both sides. Both sides of the argument. I hate it. I've got walked in front by a lady who almost tripped me up on my bike the other day.
But for pedestrians, jaywalking, crossing on a red light is not an offence. It's not an offence. There's a big difference.
Okay, no, let me finish.
Yes, it's not an offence.
That's
the question.
Why? It poses the same risk.
Yeah.
For a person crossing the road on a red light, if they get hit by a car, they can cause the same amount of damage as someone cycling across the road.
Jaywalking is not a crime.
The question is then why is one and not the other?
Why? Well, that's a different argument. We can go into it.
But then why is this what we're supposed to do?
Before we go into it, can I finish?
It's true.
Can I finish? Can I
I
just finish?
Okay, yes.
So 2 years ago, I was knocked down on a red traffic light. It was a red traffic light for pedestrians, and I was knocked down on Fulham Broadway by a pedestrian while I was on my bike. So in the same token, I can hold responsible the pedestrians that I was knocked down.
Yeah, and I'm with you there, 100%.
You can take out a civil claim against them.
Yes, we
You can do that. If they're not insured, you're unlikely to get anything.
Let me take a question from the floor. So, Elizabeth?
Sorry?
Shouldn't pedestrians have
Exactly.
numbers and insurance?
we can take that up. But let me take a question from Elizabeth.
Good one.
I was really interested by what the gentleman said about your experience in Germany, and I was a question to Massim really. What are the could you tell us a bit about sort of policy in London and whether there's a sort of joined up thinking about how you design? Because I think that sort of the idea of people moving around the city and just instinctively kind of knowing that this is for cyclists and this is a really helpful thing, but we don't seem to have it in London.
Sure. Okay. This is a good question and quite an interesting one. And the best way to answer it is: do we have a cycling design standard that's uniform across the country, and actually one that's applicable to London, and also what would be applicable to Hammersmith and Fulham? So, in saying that, we've got the Department for Transport, which is main funding provider and sets a lot of the standards for the nation. We've got Transport for London, which is obviously looks after the strategic road networks, and then we've got Hammersmith and Fulham, which looks after the local road network and the main roads as well. So we've actually got quite complicated governance arrangement around this as well. So I think that's not something that we can tackle alone, if I'm honest with you. I think it's something that needs to be joined up across both the DFT, all the London boroughs, and Transport for London as well. So it's quite a difficult challenge to overcome. And also, just putting Transport for London aside for a moment, the makeup of what makes up a local area is very, very different as well. So what we think is right for Hammersmith and Fulham, it might not be the case for maybe one of the outer boroughs like Kingston or Croydon. They may see it from a different perspective. So it's quite a difficult challenge to overcome and set up one uniform design standard.
But aren't there national design standards for junction designs, for road designs, for car users?
Yes, there is.
So why can't we have that for cycling provision?
The question is, how do we coordinate that as well, and how do we find one? Even with design standards, you will not find it applicable to every case and every junction. So you always need to vary it, and that's because each junction is unique, and you have to treat it unique.
I get that, but we don't have any.
There's no question from Sarah back there. Let me take a question from. Yes.
Thank you. I live on Carnival Road, so I'm on the junction of Carnival Road, Townend Road, and Wandsworth Bridge Road. The lights are horrendous. There's no green man. I've lived in Fulham all my life. I've lived there 35 years. We've been petitioning. Apparently, the council passed it over to TfL. TfL won't do nothing about it. They pass it back over to the council. There's no resolution. There's a few problems there. That you cannot cross safely as a pedestrian. You have cyclists who jump the red lights. You have cars turning in every bloody direction. They're coming off of Wandsworth Bridge. They're coming off of Wandsworth Bridge Road. They're coming from Carnival Road. It is really, really horrendous. I also see, I don't know if anyone's been to the bar on Wandsworth Bridge. I don't know what it's called, Neverlands. I watched that from my house. My goodness, the way cab drivers stop on Wandsworth Bridge, it's diabolical. The way then the pedestrians that are coming out of that bar who just leg it across Wandsworth Bridge, I don't get it. But something really has to be done with that junction. I have seen many an accident. I first aided many of people on that junction. I think it's disgusting that the council and TfL together do not address this. What are you waiting for? Someone to die? Sorry, I don't know who you all are, whether you're from the council or TfL, or however, I'm not bothered. But something needs to be done. There were going to be deaths. There was barriers to stop the cars going, if there was a car accident. The barriers are taken away. There's, it really...
Okay, thank you. Let's take a question from you.
Hi then, so just by way of introduction, I'm actually one of the local councillors. I can never quite remember what my title is. I think I'm walking and cycling champion, or czar. I'm not a champion either of those things in any kind of meaningful way. So I've lived in the Netherlands. A lot of my family's Dutch. I used to live in Eindhoven, and yeah, I take your point. In the Netherlands is very similar. There is a unified kind of standard. Anybody that's been to the Netherlands, cycle lanes are a very specific colour, and you're at risk of assassination as a politician if you want to change the colour of a Dutch cycle lane. The Dutch will murder you for it. It's a very specific design standard that I don't know. I think it's so well established. It's 40 years old, 50 years old. It's decades and decades. It's not something that just. I think this concept that the Dutch culturally cycle is nonsense. My gran from the Netherlands was no different to my grandfather from Scotland. There's nothing cultural in the Dutch genetic makeup that makes them cycle more. It's how their streets have been designed. And I think, going back to the point you made about this idea of standardisation, I think in London, if I did have a magic wand, I'm sure it would cause all kinds of other problems I haven't thought of. The idea of every single separate borough having its own separate transport authority. And you notice that as you walk through London, you walk from one side of the border to the other, and the bins change. You walk from one side to the other, and the signage is a bit different, because now you're in Bromley instead of being here, and now you're here. And yeah, you can see it. I'm sure everybody in West London knows that feeling when you go from Hammersmith and Fulham into Kensington and Chelsea, especially in the tourist areas, various kind of political reasons and policy reasons. Kensington and Chelsea went through a real phase of not liking pedestrian crossings. Everybody was meant to be aware of the surroundings around them, and it will make the streets much safer and everybody much more awake if we get rid of all the green men. For those of you, if you're around Hyde Park, Exhibition Road area, it's amazing when you wander through Kensington and Chelsea how few pedestrian crossings there are, and that was a specific kind of decision they took. But I think it does cause problems as you move as a cyclist or as a pedestrian from one borough to the other. All of a sudden the design standards are a bit different. Suddenly the cycle lane's a different width, or it's integrated with the road in a different way. And it's very confusing for motorists, it's confusing for cyclists, it's confusing for pedestrians, But I think we really don't recognise quite how massive an impact very, very subtle design differences can have on how we perceive an area. I wish I could remember it, somebody's written a fascinating article about how this pavement material will communicate to the average British person how wealthy an area is. You can just look at the paving stones, and that's a middle class place. Look at the pavement, that's where poor people live. Because there's just a subtle difference in the road surfacing. I know Glasgow's road surfacing is completely different to London, and it's bizarre when you think they're not that far away. But I think also the cultural things that my mum's cousin works in local government in the Netherlands, and just as a final point, I remember asking them for some help with regards to some of the stuff we were doing at Hammersmith and Fulham, saying in Britain we're having this real issue with bus stop bypasses. There's a real conflict over how they're discussed. They've become a real kind of conflict point in the design of so much of what we're doing in London. And I will think that the British, we have a real desperation to redesign the wheel and do it our way, rather than think the Netherlands have been building these for about 80 years. They know what they're doing to an extent. But I said, can you give us information from your local government about the safety of bus stop bypasses? What was all the data you've got? And he was like, why would we have data on that? I was like, well, what do you mean? It's like, are there accidents? He's like, why would there be accidents? And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he's like, well, what do you mean? He couldn't understand my question because to him that was just a bus stop. And it had never occurred to them. They were so ingrained into their culture, that's just how you made a bus stop. It literally had never occurred to him as a local government officer who dealt with these things that this would ever be a problem. Nobody had ever, and you think, it's 100 miles away across the sea, and yet this design issue, which causes real difficulty in the UK and has become a real issue, it literally never occurred to them that this would be a problem.
I've lived in the Netherlands, just quickly. Do you think that Dutch cyclists are more polite to each other? Because I think they were.
No.
No.
I'll explain. Do you speak Dutch?
Compared to London, I thought they were considerably more polite to each other.
Very quickly.
They've just learned to understand their environment a lot better.
No, the aggression of London cyclists.
One little point, do you speak Dutch?
No.
Because it has a very bizarre thing. There are two words in the language for cycling. Britain has one, English has one, cycling. In Dutch it's wielrennen or fietsen. Fietsen is the main word for cycling. So a cyclepath is a fietspad. And fietsen means I'm going to the shops, I'm going to school, I'm going to work, I'm on the bike, it's my crappy bike that squeaks and doesn't have brakes that work very well when I go at 10 miles an hour on it, and it's just what most people would say as a Dutch bike, you know, the old person going over the canals in Amsterdam, fietsen. Wielrennen means sport cycling.
Yeah.
And they see them as two different concepts, and they do not design their network for sport cycling. Their network is designed purely for transportation. Rather than...
But then people are showing respect by not zooming down them in a sport.
But I think
there are different things, again,
they
this is
have
exactly
different
what I was
rules for
explaining,
that.
different things for different...
just the one phrase that somebody came up with, which I loved, was this idea that London has a cyclist it deserves. And what we meant by that was...
Now, I want to take a question on this from George. And the reason is, in all these design processes, the sector that we tend to overlook most is that of young people. So, George, what would work for you? What would you change if you had the magic wand or the ability? What would you improve?
Can you bring back to the point when you were younger, not now, 16 years old, but
this is correct.
George was on the road from age of 7.
Yeah. So George cycled to school pretty much from, as Mom said, from the age of 7. He would cycle to school, cycle from school to Chelsea on the main roads. Yes. From there to Bishop's Park, where he would do tennis. From there to North Kensington, where they would do whatever else, to football, and this has been his life.
On your own?
Initially with parents, and then from about the age of 11 or so
Wow.
Yes. And this is it's also impressive that you are finding that strange when it is something that should be natural. Now, if you go to Holland, children do this from about the age of 7. 6, they cycle on their own. If you go to a whole raft of African countries with or without any kind of infrastructure network, the simple fact is this is their environment, so children are allowed from the age of 4 and 5 to make journeys either on their own or with a sibling maybe a year or two older. Here we have designed children and young people out of the environment. George, what would you change?
There's quite a lot of change. Definitely, to touch quickly on like pedestrian crossings, especially in Chelsea, it's been a complaint from many people for years. It's a death trap. Like the one on Wandsworth Bridge Road. If you go up the King's Road all the way down to like towards Sloane Square, there's like a whole road of like traffic light after traffic light after traffic light. No zebra crossing, no green light. So people just, and it's all crossroads with cars that can turn in, left, right. And so you're there and you're trying to cross the road, and then all of a sudden there's a new car coming from a different direction, and you're like, hold on here. And you get stuck at the junction for 5-10 minutes because you don't want to die, and you're trying to cross the road. And it's very problematic. There's something that I'm trying to talk to the council for years and nothing ever changes. And then moving forward, with like cycling and stuff like that. So like from a young age I've been cycling, so I've always felt very comfortable on the roads. Growing up I cycled with my mum and my dad, and we would have this little formation where like one parent would be at the front, and then me or my sister would be in the middle, and then my other parent at the back. And I think that safety net, especially as a young person, was important years ago when cycling was even less common and less accepted as it is now. Like car attitudes were very poor. Drivers often ignore cyclists, or they give very little leeway. Like even, for example, coming here today, I was cycling down the back street here, beside Hurlingham Park, and the way the roads are constructed, they curve inwards at certain points. and there's a car speeding around me to get to the speed bump, which makes no sense because you have to slow down at the speed bump. So like, I'm going to overtake you again. And so he speeds past me to overtake me, just to slow down in front of me as soon as he gets in front of me at the speed bump. And so we're playing this game where he's just speeding in front of me like three straight times, and it's like, it's not safe. And for me, for someone who's been riding for near 10 years now, I'm okay with it. I mean, I've had 1, 2 accidents max, and after my accident, I took a break from cycling for a little bit. I didn't stop completely, but I definitely wasn't as eager, nor was I traveling as much or as fast. But for someone like my friends, a group of my friends who have recently got bikes because they see how convenient it is, we did a journey down to Southside in Wandsworth, and during that journey, a couple of my friends must have had like 2 or 3 near-death experience. Like, it was so bad. As in, like, we went down Wandsworth Bridge Road to go around the roundabout, and a bus almost turned into him. It's like, how? And then we're turning right into Southside, and there's this road with 4 car lanes, no cycle lane, no way to switch across, and so you're supposed to be cycling on the left, you want to turn right, you have to go across 4 lanes of cars. Like, that's highly unreasonable, especially for me. That is tough to balance. For a new rider who's been riding, a month, 2 months max, that is extremely dangerous for the car, for the cyclists, for the cars as well. And so I think the roads need to be designed in a more like manageable, like not a manageable way, but with more thought for cyclists, drivers, attitude. Definitely.
Some of them are ancient and very narrow, I would say.
Of course, but then even
not like we do about that.
Then even the wider roads are designed with 2 or 3 not 2 or 3 car lanes and no cycle lanes. It's like you could have 2 car lanes and then a completely free cycle lane, and that way you have no issue. And so
you can't knock a load of buildings off the side of the street.
No, but the thing about this, let me address that, Julian. You see, most people, everybody looks at Holland as the place that offers the design standard.
Yeah.
The thing to understand is that Dutch roads are actually narrower for the most part than British roads.
Okay.
What they have done, for the most part, is take away the parked cars. If you go back to what Brenda said, the problem with her estate wasn't that there was no space for traffic, it was that what space there was occupied by for storage. I'd like to posit something for everybody to think about. Who here knows their neighbours?
Me. Sorry.
Where did you meet your neighbour? Think back for a second. Where did you first meet your neighbour?
On the street.
Is there anybody who met their neighbour anywhere else? There should be at least one person who met their neighbour somewhere else.
I'm in a big block of flats.
Okay, brilliant. So you met your neighbour on the landing. Good. I had to have one.
I'd lived in my flat for a long time. My neighbour moved in, and I'd actually met her at school.
So the reason why I bring this up is because it shows a purpose of streets that we do not recognize anymore. That streets are first and foremost a social space. They form a part of our environment and a part of our social experience. It is where we stop to talk, to interact, to trade with people, to discover our surroundings. It's literally, for many of us who are fortunate, it's where we grow up. And then in the last sort of 2-3 decades, we changed all that. We very quietly and very slowly seeded these streets from the purpose that they were used for by people and gave them over to 2 purposes. One is storage, personal property storage, and the other is the dominance of motor traffic. The question then becomes, are we missing a trick now by not looking back at what we had before?
Yeah.
because because this is a gradual increment and it's been a gradual process, we lose sight of it even though the colonization is still occurring at pace now. We might not have more cars on the streets now than we've had in the past, but we have bigger cars. So even at this, the streets are still being colonized, and now, in addition to the bigger cars, we have more cars driving more miles on streets that they didn't. So in the last sort of 10 years, the amount of driving has doubled, but not on main roads. It's now on all the side roads. Question?
So on this side of the community centre, there's a school. There's a school on that side. You cannot walk on the pavement. You cannot cross the road because cars are parked up in illegally the way that they're parking to stop and take their kids out and drop their kids off at school. I understand some people have to travel in a car to get their children to school. However, when I was a child growing up, we was on cycles, much like you was, grew up. We had cycle proficiency classes in school. I don't know if that still goes on nowadays.
It does.
I'm so glad, but I do wonder how many adults buy a cycle and don't put the helmet on, just get on their bike, and they've never cycled on the road before. And there's a few points. I'm not a car driver. I wonder how much time is spent when people do their tests or their lessons on cyclists and how people use the roads. Back in the day, kids, I'm a youth worker, kids have always cycled to meet their mates. They still do it now. They're using, I know they're not Boris cycles anymore, I don't know what they're called, but they still use them cycles. And I think it's wonderful. I think it's a great encouragement for these young people to be cycling to meet their children. He had the parents who showed him, Robert? No? George, sorry. George, you've had good parents who show you how to use the road. And I think a lot of parents now are nervous and scared. But from what you were saying, where I live in a tiny little block, there's a little bit of outside space. Do you know what it's used for? A car park. Do you know what I want it for? The amount of families that are in there whose children have got nowhere to play. Never mind the cars, get the cars out the block. Sorry, it's not my personal
Thank you for that. Okay.
How many of us know how many people use a car to go to work in London? 29%. I find that absolutely extraordinary. And yet, the car dominates.
I'm actually surprised.
And you made such a good point. When you're in a car, whom do you meet? I actually think it's spot on.
This is a very important perspective here.
When you're on the tube, you have somebody to talk to. I've talked to people on the tube, on the bus. In a car, what can I do? You're enclosed in a box, yet the car dominates. Only 29% use the car to go to work.
Can I ask if there are there any drivers here, please? Am I the only person here who drives?
No, maybe the question will be, is there people who only drive?
Okay, yeah. Is there anybody here who drives and doesn't use pretty much other forms of transport?
But the government, because of COVID, obviously has encouraged a lot more people to use their cars. So I wonder if that percentage has changed lately. I think people are not encouraged to use their legs to drive their kids to school when they live in front of Broadway and they're driving down here to drop their kids off at school. Come on, get the bus, get a cycle.
So I don't know. I grew up in a town called Troon in the west of Scotland, which is probably only famous for golf and nothing else. But public transport was not brilliant, and every single kid desperately wanted to learn to drive the second they hit 17. The minute you were able to learn to drive, you had to do it because it really was your only way if you wanted to go to the cinema or go bowling or anything with friends. But I was having quite an interesting conversation with my dad. The street where I grew up on, it's a Scottish town with lots of land, so everybody in our street had big driveways. And I can remember my parents moved in the mid-80s, and there was a couple, or two sisters, who lived next door to them, who didn't have a car. They were both, they were much older and had lived together. And my dad can remember they complained, and they thought it was a bit vulgar. The painter-decorator who lived across the road parked his van on the street. And that was not the done thing. It was a horrible decorator's van with a horrible colourful logo, and it was an ugly thing. Everybody had a driveway, or if they didn't have a driveway, you could go the path behind the house and park there. And they thought it was socially irresponsible to park on the street in the mid-80s. And their assumption, and also there was an attitude that the street was where kids played. And if you were stupid enough to leave your car there and it got a window done, then well, it was your own fault. Rather than the idea that whereas, and I can see the change. Whereas now in that street, my parents' neighbours, a lovely couple, Ian and Hazel, they're the nicest people. Their son owned a limo company, got a huge driveway. They used to store limousines on it. It can take 4 cars, and they park both cars on the street in front of the house. And my dad goes for his Thursday night pint with Ian. He said, "Why are you leaving both your cars out in the street? Why?" And he's like, "Well, there are spaces." And he's like, "Well, the street's huge. What do you mean there are spaces?" Like, "Well, if we don't put them there, somebody will put their car there and block the view." So that was his logic, and I will block my own view parking there to block the view. And whereas 30 years ago the residents in that house thought it was terrible that somebody would park a van in the street and leave their car out there. And that's a change over about 35, 40 years.
Let me take a bit. Massim, you had something to say.
No, I just I feel we're starting to, our conversation's evolving more into the society aspects and the social aspects of the environment. I just wanted to go back just one step, and that was when we were looking at different perspectives. We tended to look at whether someone's a driver, whether someone's a pedestrian, or whether someone's a cyclist in all terms. But I just wanted to raise the fact that if we pick one of those modes, for example, cycling, there are different types of cyclists, and we've got to remember that as well. We've obviously had the perspective of George, who started cycling very young as well. We've got different types of cyclists. Those who are very, very confident, who also use the carriageway, like you do, Julian, as well. You use a carriageway. You don't always use dedicated cycle lanes. But there are lots of people who we are trying to bring into the fold of cycling as well. Those people are taking their first steps into cycling. They may do it as a leisure exercise. They may begin to use it as a mode of transport. And that's one of the things that we need to remember as well. And I think that's important to remember as well.
A slight problem there. Some people can't cycle. Elderly people, they can't cycle. That is a problem.
My 82-year-old mother-in-law cycles to the shops in Hanover.
Let me take a bit of
Yes, I agree with Brendan. I agree with all the others who pointed to the fact that lying at the heart of our problems in transport around London is on-street parking. We have allowed our streets to be turned into car parks. It destroys the environment, it blocks roads, it's crept up on us. We didn't stamp on it way back in the 70s when it first became a problem, and now it's grown to the stage where, as you're pointing out, Brenda, if you try to change things, you get this massive resistance from people who got used to being able to put their cars pretty much where they like them. It's not only a change here, it didn't used to be that way in this country. It's not that way in the Netherlands. It's not that way in the United States.
No.
I mean, in a country which is completely addicted to the automobile, you do not park on the street in New York City. I mean, or if you do it, you're within 10 minutes NYPD
But
on
what
top
about
of
in
it.
suburban
In
parts
suburban,
of
most
town?
people in suburban tend to have drives in the same way as we're saying was in Scotland. And this is in a city which has a much denser population density than there's London. People use subterranean car parking.
The houses are much older.
Thank
They're
you.
much older and
Can I finish my
smaller.
question?
Where, America?
Yeah, you can't compare us to
Of
America.
course you can compare it.
Julian,
My
we are
question
just
is-
much
Julian,
older.
one moment.
Yeah.
Thank you. If I could continue. My
But don't
question
compare
then-
it.
Julian, one moment. Let us take
My
this.
question then is, having got to this tangle, what powers do we have to redress it? You must try if I may. I mean, if, for example, you have the situation that Brendan described in her opening remarks. You've got a narrow street where there's a certain amount of conflict between pedestrians and cyclists, and if you, the borough, decide that the way to resolve this is to remove those parking spaces, I can see you wincing. But the politics, of course, are toxic. Brendan's already made that very clear. You will get screened. Do you, the borough, actually have the power to take out the parking spaces and put W lines down, or does it have to go to TfL or higher?
I think a major change like that has to be an adopted policy, because it would impact so many people. So a major change like that has to be an adopted policy. If you're talking about powers within legislation, and yes, we are able to do that, but I think parking is very, very sensitive, and we have to be able to meet the needs of people and the community as well. And it's not the case that active travel is everyone's choice or within everyone's ability. I think there will always be a need to retain parking. I think the question is how much of it should be dedicated to parking as well.
Take Henrietta.
Talking on, if we're balancing the needs of the community for this valuable piece of real estate where people are parking cars, if we're looking into the future, the climate model suggests that we could be seeing 4 to 7 degrees higher temperatures in the summer maximums, and planting trees would make an enormous difference to how cool or livable the streets would be. And if we could remove some cars, we could plant more trees on the roads, bigger trees, because there would be, if they're replacing car parking spaces, they would be further away from the houses, so the householders wouldn't be quite so worried about the roots getting into their houses. And we need the greenery. The trees would improve the air pollution, and we can have more benches as well. We can have more little parklets, more greenery. Perhaps we should be working out what the value of, what the true value of that land space is, and charging the car drivers for the true value of the car park.
Yes, we'll take that. Okay, I'm going to come to you. Let me take George first.
Taking the point further forward as well, wouldn't, especially with our target of trying to reduce carbon emissions, wouldn't having less car parking spaces reduce the
demand for cars?
Yeah, because, well, take for example, my cousins, they have 3 cars?
At least
3 cars? Why? Because they have the space to park them.
That's true.
They probably don't need 3 cars. They need maybe 2 max, 1 for each parent will both work. But they don't need a 3rd car. They have it because, well, they can afford it and they can park it. So wouldn't having less parking spaces emphasize other forms of transport? Because simply put, you can't keep buying cars and then just storing them in different places.
Yes. Yes.
Can I just, if your cousin and their family have become accustomed to having free spaces as well, I think if a body came along and removed all 3 at once, it would be a difficult thing to achieve, I think. And it's similar when we're talking about parking in general in the local authority. We're trying to bring a community along into our way of thinking. And it happened with, when CPZs first came, a lot of the resident community did not want to control parking zones. It's only when they came in that they said, well, actually, that works over there. Can you put one in this area as well? I think the thing you're talking about is change, and that can't happen instantly. So I think it's incremental change, and it's taking incremental steps, bringing people on board, bringing the community on board as well. And I think we find that quite common in transport and parking schemes. It's across the board really. If we're trying to do something, there's a time for a new scheme to bed in, there's a time for a new policy change to become acceptable for people, and that's something which is very, very